After all of the conversations we've had this morning about how we can actually engage our business with our consumers, bringing them into the boardroom, actually collaborating more with them, I'm really thrilled to be presenting this case study, which kind of started out as a means to try and understand what was going on in what could traditionally have been viewed as quite a functional, quite a rational services journey. And one of the reasons, as I'll detail in a short minute, that we were looking to do that was how could Virgin Media actually disrupt what was going on? How could they make it easier for their consumers to actually make the decision and hopefully make the decision to go with them, Virgin Media? But what ended up happening was something so much more than we'd ever expected, and has subsequently become a piece of research that they, by their own admission, say is the single most influential piece of research they've ever conducted. Because what ended up happening, by looking at that entire consumer journey, we actually brought into one room all of the key people who had any influence, any interaction, any engagement with consumers. And we started bringing together parts of the business that had never actually spoken before. And in that, they started behaving completely differently. And as a result, we ended up with some really successful results after a couple of years of rethinking how we were going to take upon the whole consumer journey. So for those of you who don't know, Virgin Media is a telecoms provider. Like I said, quite a functional, rational thing, right? They provide TV content, sports channels, movie channels, TV channels, and broadband, and that very unexciting service, landlines. So really what I'm focusing on today is the path to purchase for how people come to buy that whole package. So your TV, your broadband, and your landline, all with one supplier. So when I talk about a triple play package, that's what I'm talking about, where you got your three services all together. So I'd like you all to cast your memories back, not 30 years ago, not 40 years ago, but actually to 2012. Doesn't seem that long ago, right? But actually, it was quite a different time. It felt quite different to what we're feeling, what our consumers, what our users are feeling at the moment. Coming out of 2012, it was a very austere time. We'd just come out of the recession, and our consumers were still behaving in that way. Discount codes, price comparison sites, that was part of your everyday behavior. You were using those tools to navigate just about every category. So something like a really big TV package, 200 channels, plus movies, plus sports, actually felt like quite a big indulgence. And let's not even talk about broadband, let alone the fact that they were trying to navigate what a 50 gig line versus unlimited versus higher speeds, lower speeds. I can use one device or two devices. Actually, as long as my broadband works, you know, nobody walks into the kitchen and go, "Oh, wonderful broadband today, darling." You know, as long as it's working. So getting something that was fancier and faster, especially in a time when it felt like maybe a little bit of an indulgence, where everyone's tightening their purse strings, made it quite a difficult market to operate in. In 2012, we also had a lot of new players coming into the market, much smaller companies that were specializing only in broadband, only in TV. And they were kind of devaluing and eroding the notion and benefit of having all of your services with one provider. That said, despite these new newcomers coming in, it was actually kind of still a two-horse race. It was Virgin Media, and it was Sky. And the fact of the matter was, Sky was outspending Virgin Media substantially. So Virgin looked at the situation and went, well, unless we increase our budgets hugely, we're going to have to start rethinking what we're doing. We're going to have to start thinking of ways where we actually spend our money more smartly. We need to think of ways where we can achieve the same or achieve more with the same budget. And that was really where they came to us. That was the context in which they were sitting, where they were thinking, in order for us to grow, we've got to do things differently. And clearly, we need to think about things completely outside of where we're currently standing. So one of the key things that they identified was, if they look at their world and they know that this is their world, and they've been addressing their world, and they've been responding to the insights that they'd seen and identified in other research, they still needed to do something more. So actually what they needed was a research approach that went beyond this world and identified all of this. looking at something that completely went beyond what their own assumptions were, what we called the couch insights, the things that they were basing a lot of their strategic thoughts and plans on, that was based on their son or their cousin, their daughter. Those couch insights, which were often valid, but actually, how could we think beyond that? How could we think outside of that? So we really needed a research approach that allowed us to go beyond all of that. So what did we do? Well, we used a methodology that's a proprietary technique of Tonic's called snakes and ladders. And the idea, the name of snakes and ladders, comes from acknowledging that our world is actually a lot more random than we like to think it is. No matter what decision we're making, it can often happen in quite a random way, with a lot of random events that lead us to one point. No matter how many ways we look at it, we are not as rational and logical as we like to think we are. We don't go out and write a long list, conduct extensive research, write a short list, conduct more research, create a preferred brand, and purchase that. We do a lot of research, but actually we know that there are a lot of other things that are going on. We're all called researchers. We've seen it happening. We know that people are making emotive decisions. We know that people are making decisions on the fly. We know that they are automatically qualifying in and dequalifying brands in ways that they can't even articulate. So it's kind of like a game of snakes and ladders, really. You kind of go through life, and as the game suggests, a ladder will take you much closer to that final decision, whether it is taking out a triple play services package, or forming a brand relationship, or even upgrading or downgrading a service that you currently have. And a snake, on the other hand, is the one that suddenly moves you completely away from that. So this was our philosophy that we came to it, and we were thinking, how do we actually get to that? Having direct questioning means that with a direct question, implicit in our question is an assumption. So, for example, if I say to you, how many brands did you consider? Implicit in that question is that you considered some brands at all. Whereas actually, maybe you'd automatically qualified one brand in and dequalified a whole lot out. But because I've asked you how many you considered, human nature is to give a response. So we knew that we couldn't go about this with a direct questioning technique. We knew that we had to do something differently. So we used storytelling. Now, I'm not going to claim to be the first agency that's using storytelling. We are not innovative in that respect. Storytelling is a wonderful technique for multiple reasons. It's how we think in everyday life. We think and talk in narrative, so it feels quite comfortable, it feels quite natural. But really, the big benefit for us in storytelling was that it was from the consumer's perspective. It was their language, we weren't imposing our assumptions on them, and we weren't confining our insights to the 10 questions that we were asking. Because it was coming from them, being led by them, we were getting all of the other peripheral stuff that was going on. Everything else that we might not actually have even thought of. And for us to really understand how to disrupt a journey, we needed to have that approach. The other thing that we do with our storytelling is that it's all regressive. We know that consumers are not very good at predicting their own future behavior. They're not particularly good even at doing what they say they're going to do. And sometimes they say one thing and think something else. So Snakes and Ladders relies on somebody telling us a story about the journey that they have already been on, so that we know that we're grounding it in what they've been through. So typically how we would go about that is we kind of draw a journey for them, and then we sit back as the moderator and allow them to take us through the journey. This is actually about an electric toothbrush as an example. But as you can see, they tell us, and we just map events onto that journey as we go by. Now, I'm sure some of you are reading what's on there. Doesn't sound very exciting, does it? It's quite rational. And actually, that again is human nature. When you start telling a story, you don't remember everything. The human brain cannot possibly remember every single thing that's happened to us. So you start telling the things that you first recall, the things that are in your conscious world, and actually the things that you feel quite comfortable sharing with someone, especially someone that you don't know at all, this interviewer who's suddenly invaded your space. But as they start relaxing into the conversation, realizing that it's not a Q&A, I'm not going to be testing you, it's just you and your life experiences, they start relaxing more and more, and they start revealing more about themselves. But actually, where we've taken storytelling to the next level is kind of using the police as inspiration. We don't stop at this version of the story. This is the conscious version. This is what they want to portray about themselves. We actually go a step further, and we actually get them to tell that story again. And we unpick each of the points, and we go through. So, for example, it says you went onto Google and searched best electric toothbrush. And we just get the person to elaborate a little bit more about what that means. Again, without overly prompting them. So what you end up with is a journey that gets built out. As you can see, it's building out over here. And the number of times I've sat in an interview where somebody has gone, oh my God, I didn't realize so many things happened. I thought it was much simpler than that. And as they start elaborating, we start learning more about the emotive decisions that they made, the things that maybe they didn't want to admit, like, for example, taking advice from someone that they really aspire to. We start learning about brand relationships and all of the peripheral things that maybe they didn't remember at first or that they didn't really deem necessary to tell you. One of my favorite interviews of all time was actually on this particular project, and I was interviewing this young girl. She was 22, she was in her first job, she was actually working 2 jobs at that point in time. She had a little 1-year-old boy, and she spent the entire interview telling me about every single benefit of Virgin Media. I swear she knew more about Virgin Media than my clients at Virgin Media actually know. She could motivate every single reason why you should have that service. Her brother had it, her father had it, she knew that it was a good service. She said it was better value for money than Sky was, and yet she purchased Sky. I was flummoxed. I couldn't work it out, and the more she spoke, the more she motivated about how great Virgin Media was, not Sky. Anyway, we just let the conversation go, and about 45 minutes, an hour into the interview, it eventually came out. When she was at school, she didn't have Sky or Virgin Media. She remembers all of the cool kids at school coming in and talking about the cool programs that they'd watched the night before that she didn't have access to. She said to herself, when I'm a grown-up, when I've made it, I will have Sky. So for her, it was all about a badge of honor. Having the satellite dish outside her house made her feel part of a Sky Club. And even though she could rationalize Virgin Media, there was such a strong brand relationship that she had automatically disqualified Virgin Media. And that's really what the technique allows us to uncover, things like that, those brand relationships that someone isn't going to admit outright. No one's going to sit there and go, oh, well, only the cool kids have Sky, I was aspiring to be them. But she relaxed into it, and that's what we then learned about her. So as you can see, with a methodology like this, it's extremely holistic. It pretty much covers everything, things that we couldn't even have dreamt of uncovering. And actually how the whole project had started was the marketing team commissioning us to do this research. And as I said at the beginning, it then went so much further. And this is what we ended up with. So it will be a lot of very small text for most of you. But this was a wall chart that we produced at the end of the research. It is a journey detailing the different phases that we had identified in the research, looking at, for example, over here, the trigger stage. What were the triggers that were going on in the active search phase? Which touch points were they engaging with? How were they engaging with those? How were they making those decisions? And ultimately identifying opportunities for Virgin Media at each point along the journey. Now you can see when you present something holistically like this isn't just about marketing communications anymore. This starts calling in the web team, the call center team, the sales team, the social team. And so by having this holistic journey that we were able to present, it was a really good reason to then get everyone into a room and start workshopping it. Start talking about, actually, if we're going to have a seamless consumer experience, what is it going to look like? How are we all going to act on this together? And I think that was really where the success of the project came into its own, that by having different people looking at it and going, actually, when you're doing that, that means I can then do this. And they started having conversations that they simply hadn't had before. So we totally broke down those interdepartmental silos, ended up workshopping it, and actually walking away with clear action points about what each person in each department was going to do off the back of this. It was actually also one of the most exciting debriefs I've ever done, because instead of debriefing off a PowerPoint presentation, we laid these, printed almost as big as it is at the moment, down on the boardroom table, and we got everyone to stand up and walk around it. And seeing it in this holistic way meant that it didn't feel as linear as a PowerPoint can feel, because you could then talk about something over here and very easily reference something back. And actually now, when I go into the Virgin offices, every single department has a huge wall chart printed up and hung on the walls, and every single new starter gets a little version printed out in their starter pack. The idea is, every single decision that you're making, you need to keep coming back to your consumer. Are we identifying and acting on an opportunity that we had identified in this piece of research? So what did we actually do as a result of the research? Well, one of the key things that we had seen was, yes, indeed, it was a confusing category. It was a confusing journey for our consumers to go on. And in many respects, actually the industry has created that. They've thrown jargon at the poor consumers trying to work it all out. 200 channels, 5 sports channels, 50 gig line, unlimited download speeds, unlimited downloads. And suddenly I'm going, oh my God, well, what's the difference between these two packages? And there's no easy way to actually compare them. So what's happening is we force the consumers to take the price comparison route because they've got no other way to actually navigate a very confusing category. Insurance does the same thing. Mobile phone networks do something similar. Services are, in a large way, actually doing that. But our consumers are lazy. They don't want to spend all of that time doing research. They've got better things to do. Actually, what they want to do is make a snap decision. They want to be our young girl and go, actually, I feel really confident about getting Sky. That's great. They don't want to spend weeks on end creating their own comparisons, Excel spreadsheets. You should see some of the things people were doing just to try and understand what was going on. But it's confusing, and as a result, they're having to do a lot of research, going to a lot of touch points. So the key opportunity we identified was, what can we do to make it easier? How can we, at each one of those stages of our journey, make it easier for them to go, I'll go with Virgin Media? And as a result of identifying that key objective, we then saw some wonderful actions, which I'll briefly take you through after this, which led to a notable increase from a business and commercial perspective. So 2 key things that happened alongside a revised product strategy. In 2014, Virgin Media saw a significant uplift in sales, particularly in their triple play package sales. The other thing is, working alongside their ad agency, we were doing some testing using some of their direct mail creatives and actually comparing those that employed the insights that we had identified now versus others, and we saw a significantly higher response rate for the creatives that were employing the insights that we had uncovered now. Which were, the first one is identifying that actually there was this automatic qualification that was happening at the beginning. Brands that were considered from the very beginning were more likely to be purchased at the end. So Virgin identified the need to connect more with their consumers right at the start of the journey, actually before people were even thinking about changing their package or getting a new one. So a couple of things that they did, they started talking about more of their content in advertising. So instead of screaming about having all of these TV channels, having the fastest broadband in the UK, they started talking about what can you actually access with the service that we're giving you. What world does it open up to? They tapped into a consumer need. So here's an example of a animal archetype that they created, which was called Nick the Navy SEAL. And Nick the Navy SEAL loved to game. So they had this whole communication about him and a whole bunch of other animal archetypes, tapping into that core consumer need of how they were actually using their packages. And they started using a very big Virgin asset, that bright red. So even if people were getting direct mail through the door and then weren't opening it, it was still having a brand building activity. We identified that for Virgin customers, they were making a very rational decision, much more than our Sky customers. They were doing a lot more research. They were much more knowledgeable about the product. So instead of trying to change that behavior, we decided, let's act on that even more. So we started giving them more tools to make that smart choice and actually ultimately brag about it. So we started using longer flyers in our direct mail, product comparisons, so saying actually Virgin Media has as many channels as Sky does, and direct price comparisons. We learned that the role of word of mouth and recommendation actually came down to people seeking reassurance. They wanted to get the answer that made them feel comfortable with that decision. So Virgin started using social proof, such as this advert here. Every minute, someone like you joins Virgin Media. We know that online is ingrained behavior and it's not going anywhere. So we relooked the search strategy, and so they started buying AdWords earlier on in the journey. So for example, buying AdWords around home move and things like that, removal vans, and looking at it and identifying from the triggers that we'd seen where we could actually bring in Virgin Media much earlier on in that journey. And finally, as I've hinted at quite a lot, at the end of it, they walked away with a completely new sales strategy, ultimately with the goal of creating a seamless experience for our consumers. So, call center scripts were revised. The sales incentivization was changed. And as the image shows here, they completely redesigned their new joiners page. So it was much easier for the consumer to come on and join, rather than having to go through various pages before they could actually join. So, what made this project a success? For me, I think that there are 4 key factors that really led to it becoming that singularly most influential piece of research. The first, as I've already said, is that having a holistic piece of research meant that we automatically had to break down the barriers internally, and we had to take a holistic approach internally. But we couldn't have done that without having a senior team who were able to bring in other senior team leaders, department heads, and actually having the authority to put their foot down and say, okay, we are now making an action off each of these insights. Who's going to take responsibility for each of those? But from the very beginning, we actually workshopped all of our ideas. We spoke about those couch insights. We spoke about key working hypotheses that people were working towards, so that actually we could look at what were they. How could we bring that all together and work together to come up with something that would actually be game-changing? We didn't want to stand there and present a journey that everybody already knew. So knowing what people thought they knew from the very beginning meant that we could push our insights even further. But at the end of the day, what we really needed was them being open to being disproved. So having that open forum where we got everyone's insights and thoughts and hypotheses on the table meant that there was an opportunity for them to be proved wrong.